Now to developments overseas. From the devastating attacks on U.S. forces in Afghanistan and the ongoing investigation into that deadly attack at the U.S. consulate in Libya. We've got both covered for you with 2 live reports from the regions. We begin first with NBC's Atiya Abawi, joining me now live from Kabul. Atiya, we've had insider attacks. We've had U.S. forces, NATO forces attacks against civilians. But most notably, perhaps, we've had that attack, the Taliban claiming responsibility for the attack on a key U.S. base, U.S. joint NATO base on Friday.
That's right, Andrea. It's been a very violent weekend here in Afghanistan, and it started Friday night in the overnight hours when the Taliban breached the perimeter of that NATO base that you're talking about, one of the largest NATO bases in Afghanistan, I should say. It's when I've been there, I thought it would be impossible to breach, but 15 Taliban fighters made their way in. They killed 2 U.S. Marines in their attack, and they destroyed U.S. Marine Harrier jets on the runway there, causing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. Then this weekend, we saw more of these insider attacks that we've been talking about all year. 2 British soldiers were killed and 4 American soldiers were killed by Afghan police officers, people they thought they could trust, people they thought they were helping, who then turned their weapons on them. The Taliban obviously claiming responsibility for all of these attacks. And then today we saw the first violent protest, protesting against this anti-Islamic movie that has caused outrage throughout the Muslim world. But the last few days, they've ended quite peacefully. But today, just outside of the city limits, hundreds of protesters demanded that death to America. They were chanting that. They were hurling rocks. They set police cars ablaze. They wanted to make it to the U.S. Embassy, but the police did stop them. And the Afghan police, we should also mention, at least 45 Afghan police officers sustained minor injuries, stopping these Afghans from making it into the city limits and trying to make their way to the U.S. Embassy here. Andrea?
And what about the suicide bomber against the children who were part of a skateboarding group, this tragedy last week?
That is an absolute tragedy. It's the little children that we see all the time standing outside of ISAF headquarters. The U.S. military sees them outside near the bases. They sell headscarves. They sold little trinkets. And this teenage suicider made their way into this really protected area. And apparently these children were fighting with this teenager, saying that you're on our territory, get out. That teenager felt agitated, detonated his weapons. He wanted to target Americans. Instead, he killed 6 children that are part of this group, as you mentioned, called Skatistan, where they were trying to better their lives. But unfortunately, their lives ended at a very young age. Andrea?
Atiya Abawi in Kabul. And now on to the investigation into the deadly attacks in Benghazi. NBC's Ayman Mohadeen is in Benghazi. Ayman, we've seen a disagreement between what the UN ambassador, Susan Rice, said to David Gregory on Meet the Press, saying that this was spontaneous, and what the Libyan officials, the acting president, said to you, that this was a planned attack with al-Qaeda influence.
That's correct. Libyan officials are not holding back the idea that 2 things happened here. One, a group of foreign elements entered Libya over the course of the last several months, perhaps as a result of the security vacuum that exists in this country. And once they entered, once they set up shop here, they then put in motion a plan to carry out an attack. And they cited to us over the course of the last several months, there have been growing attacks on diplomatic missions, including the British ambassador here, or the British diplomat here, and other foreigners. And for them, that was an indication that there was something brewing, something troubling that was taking place in post-revolutionary Libya. The time and the specifics of when an attack might have been put in motion to be carried out against the U.S. facility, that is really the central question as to whether or not this was, in the eyes of U.S. officials, a pre-planned attack or as a result of a spontaneous outburst of anger. Now, we've heard U.S. officials say they had no actionable intelligence. And so the central question between the Libyan and U.S. officials here, as we understand it, is whether or not there was a very clear plan to target on September 11th the U.S. consulate, or whether or not the people on the ground, the fighters or the attackers on the ground, exploited a moment of public outrage against the U.S. and approached the U.S. consulate to carry out in that window or in that security vacuum. Right now, just a short while ago, the Deputy Minister of Interior here for the eastern part of Libya, he was fired by the Minister of Interior. A lot of that had to do with the controversy surrounding the security at the embassy and why the Libyan officials were not not able to keep the protesters and the would-be attackers at bay from the U.S. consulate. So this is the recent development that just happened within the last few minutes, Andrea.
And Ayman, let's talk about U.S. security, because there's a Senate committee is asking for an investigation by the IG into why the State Department did not have Marines there. There are no Marines in Tripoli either. They don't talk about security publicly, but they have to make decisions about where to put their resources. Why wasn't there better security, as far as you know, from the U.S. side?
Well, that's a very important question. In fact, we've been out to the U.S. consulate here in Benghazi, and by most assessments, it did not seem like a very tightly guarded compound. I've also been to many other U.S. diplomatic facilities around the world that are much more tightly guarded. This particular one was essentially a private residence that had the normal walls, but more importantly, or perhaps even more alarmingly, we spoke to one of the Libyan security guards who was a private security contractor hired to protect the U.S. facility there. He was one of the individuals wounded. We spoke to him at the hospital, and he told us that the security on the outside of the perimeter involved only about 9 Libyans and about a handful of Americans on the inside, many of them very lightly armed, that in the wake of some large demonstration or protest, it would have been nearly impossible for them to secure against. So yes, there are going to be a lot of questions as to whether or not the security at that facility was adequate. The ambassador himself traveled with very light security detail as well.
Ayman Mohyeldin, thank you very much. Thanks to Atia Abawi in Kabul as well. And who is to blame for the unraveling of the Arab Spring? And what about the threats and deaths of our troops in Afghanistan? Former Defense Secretary William Cohen joins us next. Plus, the knives are out inside the Romney